Well, good morning, everyone. It is great to see everyone present. Welcome to our community training for DV Basics, VAWA, and Engaging the YWCA. We have the pleasure of the YWCA team. They're going to educate us on these three areas. So at this time, I would like to turn it over to Trina, and I believe there's a team that will be presenting. So Trina, I'm going to turn to you. I'm going to stop share my screen in case there's something you want to share or you need me to share. So without further ado, Trina, I hand it over to you.
Thank you, Tracy. Good morning, everyone. Again, my name is Trina Sanders. I am the co-director here at the YWCA. I have some team members here with me. So team members, if you could go ahead and introduce yourselves.
Well, my name is Melissa Caldwell, and I am the other co-director here at the YWCA.
Marianne, you need to unmute.
Sorry about that. I'm Marianne Bean. I'm a lead victim advocate at the YWCA.
And I'm Tamika Standoaks. I'm the crisis helpline advocate here at the YWCA.
So we'll go ahead and get started. Under the YWCA domestic violence, the YWCA serves survivors of intimate partner violence. Intimate partner violence is abuse or aggression that occurs in a current or former romantic relationship. Intimate partner relationships includes current, former spouses, married spouses, common law spouses, civil unions, spouses, boyfriends, girlfriends, dating partners, and ongoing sexual partners. Intimate partners may or may not be cohabitating. Intimate partners can also be same-sex or opposite-sex partners. Here at the YWCA of Greater Flint, in our safe house, we have 32 beds for women and children who are fleeing domestic violence, sexual assault, stalking, or human trafficking situations. However, we do have services for men who are survivors as well. We just refer them to other local shelters or hotels or other housing options. Tamika?
Yeah, so again, I'm Tamika. I do the assessments over the phone for our survivor request forms. So I'm just gonna walk you.
Tracy, could you share the screen, the hotline assessment that was in the attachment?
I sure will.
Thank you. Sorry, Tamika.
It's okay. So I'm gonna go over our survivor assessment forms when the survivor calls our hotline. So the first thing we always go over, we ask the client if they are safe. If they're not safe, then we ask the client if we need to call 911 for them. If they say yes, then we will. If they say no, then we won't, of course. So if the client says they are in a safe environment right now, then that's when we go straight into asking the client what's their current situation that's going on today. So depending on what their situation is, then we go from there. So our assessment is broken down into 5 different assessments. And the first one is domestic violence. And some of those examples are, does the assailant use coercion or threats to control you? Does the assailant use intimidation to control you? And does the assailant use emotional abuse to control you? And of course, as always, we have that additional comment section for any additional things that the client may say that is not on the assessment under DV. So the next one is the sexual assault. And a couple examples are, what would you say your relationship is to the assailant? When was your last experience with sexual assault? And has the sexual abuse been going on? And how long, if so? So the third assessment is human trafficking. So a couple examples are, do you or did you have a boyfriend or girlfriend? Did anyone ever trick or pressure you into sexual acts that made you feel uncomfortable? And also, do you keep all of the money that you make from working? So the fourth assessment is stalking. Does your assailant follow you or show up where you are? Do they drive by your home, school, or work? Have they damaged your car, home, or other property that you may have? So the last assessment is our danger assessment. And now this last assessment is the most important. It must be done. This is going to tell us how serious your current situation is. So I'm gonna go ahead and read all of these since they are so detrimental. So the first one is, does the assailant have access to weapons? Has the assailant lost their job or income? Is the assailant abusive behavior escalating? Does the assailant have stalking behavior? Does the assailant have a history of violence? Has the assailant threatened to commit suicide or harm themselves? Has the assailant strangled you? Has the assailant threatened to harm you, family, or friends? Are you concerned about your pets being harmed by the assailant? Has the assailant behavior changed? Does the assailant know your daily whereabouts? And of course, like I said earlier, we have the couple lines just in case there's something under the danger assessment that we didn't cover, so we can add. So the next step would be safety planning with the client. All of our clients have the option of refusing safety planning over the phone. But if they choose a safety plan with us, this is some of the things that we may ask. Can you alter your routes or routines? If you have access to a vehicle, can you make it a habit of packing up the car? Are you able to make sure your vehicle has gas in it? And also, safety planning can be as simple as calling 911 to come pick you up and bring you to our facility here at the YWCA. So on the next page is when we go into the survivor's contact information, where we will ask the name, phone number, the preferred contact, and if you notice, we have right there notes of safe and unsafe times to contact. So we will ask the client when is the safest time to contact them if we need to give them a call back. And then right underneath that, that's where we have the abuser's information. Now, sometimes the clients don't like to give out that information because they don't want to get their assailant in trouble. They just want to get the help. So if they give us that information, then great. But if not, then it's not necessary for them to get help to give us that information. Okay, so on the next page of our assessment, if our shelter is full, then that's when we would call an advocate on the phone. If an advocate is, if all of our advocates are busy at the time, that's when we will send an email out to our advocacy team for someone to reach out to the client and provide additional resources. And that's Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. And we also have a second shift case manager that's available Monday through Thursday, 4 p.m. to 12 a.m. And for those emergency situations, we do have emergency on-call management after hours on Fridays and on the weekends. And so with that being said, the advocates will safety plan with the client, access the client needs relocation, and also provide additional resources for that client, just depending on the individual on what they need. So with that being said, Roy Ann, one of our lead advocates, she is next.
Fran,
Wait.
I'm so sorry. I'm not used to this. I'm sorry. Like as Tamika said, I'm Rayan Bean. I'm a victim advocate at the lead victim advocate at the YWCA. And as Tamika was talking about the safety planning part of it, what we do is once she sends out a email or contacts a victim or contacts an advocate via the telephone, the first thing we do obviously is introduce ourselves to the person on the phone. And then we kind of like assess their situation and see what kind of services that we can help them with. And then we safety plan with them. And we explain to them that when we say safety planning does not mean that they have to leave their home forever. It's just to keep them safe at that particular time. It does not take away from calling 911 if they need 911 called. Does it take away from filing a personal protection order or contacting an attorney if they need be? It's just something to help them be safe, keep safe. So the first thing that we tell them to do is collect evidence. By evidence, I mean text messages, social media contacts, voicemails if they can keep those, phone calls, any kind of like any phone calls that they can record or take screenshots of the numbers of the person calling them all the time. Any kind of medical records, text or emails, anything like that that can be used not only for the detectives if it goes to a criminal case, but also to help them get a personal protection order. That we tell them to keep that in a safe place where the abuser can't find it, such as a friend's house, a family member's house, somewhere in the house that they stay in, if they can do that without him finding out. And then we suggest to make a stash getaway bag. And in this bag, put all their important documents such as social security cards, passports, birth certificates, IDs, anything that's going to help them move on, to help them get into housing later on down the road, because it's kind of hard to obtain that kind of stuff once you're out. So, and then we tell them we suggest that they take the stash bag and put it someplace safe, whether in the trunk of their car or give it to a friend, a trusted friend, a trusted neighbor, so the abuser cannot find it. And then to have a plan of what they plan on doing once they get out. A lot of times it's not safe for them to leave at the moment the incident happened. They may have to wait till their abuser leaves to go to work. So we suggest that if they can, to call ahead of time to the shelter and tell us that they can't leave until Saturday at 2:00 because that's when he's going to work. And that way we can arrange to have a bed waiting for them and maybe even arrange transportation for them. If we don't have a room available for them, we may be able to put them up in a motel until we can get them into a shelter, our shelter or another shelter within the community or outside the community. We also, when a victim leaves their abuser, that's when it's the most dangerous. So that's why we try to explain to them to have a plan to go somewhere safe when they make the move to leave. Anything could happen. So we just try to tell them to maybe teach their children to have a code when mom says a certain word or says a certain phrase, for them to know that it's time for them to leave and run to the neighbor's house and call 911 if they can. Then we also assist them with personal protection orders if they would like to get one of those. And along with the personal protection order is the evidence that I talked about earlier that we can turn in with the paperwork to help them get their PPO granted. They need for sure to have a last known address for their abuser. Unfortunately, the courts do not like the jail to be one of the addresses that they use for the abuser. So they need like a house address and a street address for them. We also help with court support. And with our court support, I call myself the mouthpiece, but with the attorneys and the prosecutors and other community agencies and judges if there's a criminal case going on, to help the victim understand what's going on in the criminal justice system, because it can be really confusing and overwhelming for them. So a lot of times they don't understand it. So we also provide that for them. We also help the survivors with a VAWA emergency transfer plan, which is helping the survivor to get out of the lease that they're in, maybe at the apartment that they need to get out of so they can be safe, either to relocate in the same apartment complex, maybe relocate in a different apartment complex, but we also help them with filing the paperwork. So Trina, do we have a clip, the VAWA clip to play now?
Yes, Tracy's gonna play that for us.
Okay,
Okay, give me a minute.
okay.
To do today is to provide you with an overview of the housing protections under VAWA, as well as who they apply to. And then we're going to talk about best practices to help consumers / clients, folks that you work with, access VAWA housing protections, as well as other related protections. And we're also going to be providing tools and resources that housing counselors and housing providers can use to help consumers access VAWA protections. Next slide, please. Alrighty, so what is VAWA? We are going to use the shortened version of VAWA for reference because it's quite a bit to say the Violence Against Women Act every time. But just know when we say VAWA, we are referring to this federal law called the Violence Against Women Act. So very generally speaking, VAWA in part provides housing protections for survivors of domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking. Now, when you look at these four categories, I would not necessarily look at them as mutually exclusive, right? So for example, survivors of domestic violence can also experience sexual assault. And then also folks who are experiencing stalking may also be survivors of sexual assault and domestic violence. And of course, there are situations where they may be experiencing only one form of violence, right? Like for example, sexual assault. They could be experiencing, they may have been unfortunately sexually assaulted by a neighbor or a family member. And so there is no intimate partner violence involved necessarily. And all of those folks would be covered by the Violence Against Women Act. In terms of who has obligations under VAWA, there are folks who we called covered housing providers. And what I would just keep in mind in terms of that is they are basically entities or housing providers that receive some kind of subsidy or assistance from HUD, such that folks are getting rental assistance. So typical entities are public housing authorities, right? Owners and landlords in the multifamily context that are getting housing assistance or housing subsidies. And there's also other folks, including folks that are getting funding through our SNAPS office, like the homeless assistance grants, continuums of care, their sub-grantees, et cetera, et cetera. So there are a lot of folks, but I think for your frame of reference, just think if you're dealing with a consumer or client who has some kind of rental assistance, they're receiving some kind of rental assistance from the federal government, then more likely than not, the Violence Against Women Act and its protections will apply to that survivor. There's a quick note here. Oh, sorry, could you go back? There's a quick note about CDBG. For that, just keep in mind that if you're working with the survivor who is saying that they are either losing their housing or losing their assistance or potentially losing their housing or assistance because they've called the police or called emergency assistance too many times within a given period, that essentially VAWA and other laws prohibit that kind of discrimination against them. So if they're saying that they have contacted the police too many times within a given period, and that's why they're facing an eviction, that is prohibited by various laws. The last bullet point here has to do with enforcement. There's a lot of information for you to refer here, but basically, if you're working with the survivor, you think that their VAWA rights may have been violated, there are recourses. I mentioned previously that you can file a complaint with our Fair Housing Division. That is certainly an option. This guidance here provides additional guidance around that enforcement authority. Next slide. Okay, so who do the housing protections apply to? So we mentioned the survivors of the 4 different forms of violence and abuse. Those individuals are covered. Now, survivors could be applicants for, or they could actually be living in a rental units that are receiving some kind of HUD assistance or HUD subsidy. So certainly if they're living in units that are receiving HUD subsidies, that they would be subject to VAWA housing protections, but also if they're just applying, right? So if there is a survivor who is trying to get access to certain units, like public housing or Section 8 vouchers, they cannot be discriminated against because of the violence or abuse that they've experienced under VAWA. And even though the Violence Against Women Act is called the Violence Against Women Act, the protections actually apply to folks who are not only women. So folks who identify as male, transgender, gender non-binary, it applies regardless of gender, gender identity, or sexual orientation. That's really, really important to keep in mind. There's also the ability for these housing protections to apply to other people. One good example that I keep in mind is a case that I worked on a long time ago that involved a mom whose daughter was a victim of domestic violence and had broken up with the boyfriend who was the perpetrator. And the mom and the daughter lived separately. The mom lived in one apartment unit, the daughter lived in another, and they lived not close together. But the boyfriend, the ex-boyfriend, was stalking the daughter. And so often when the mom and daughter would hang out together or be in the mom's unit, the boyfriend was often around causing trouble, doing all kinds of things that were causing harm. And so because of that, the mom actually was facing a potential eviction. And even though the mom was not technically the domestic violence survivor, she was affiliated with someone who was. And because of that association, the mom was facing an eviction that was basically prohibited by VAWA. So important to keep in mind that even folks who are associated with survivors could potentially have access to these rights and these protections. And that includes other folks like live-in aides, like live in the household, guests who are in the unit, other folks as well. So just keep in mind that it's not always the person who's experiencing the direct violence or abuse that can access these protections. I mentioned briefly the right to report, or the ability for someone to call the police, have that right and not be penalized for calling the police. That is a really important right. That actually applies to everybody, regardless of whether or not someone is a survivor. So essentially anyone should be able to call the police if they are the victim or they're calling on behalf of someone else who needs help without facing any penalties in the housing context. Next slide, please. So we've talked about covered housing providers. So one question you might have is, well, what housing programs are we talking about? Generally speaking, again, I would just say if you're working with a survivor that is living in a rental unit that has some kind of federal housing subsidy, more likely than not, they are eligible for VAWA protections. But in this slide and also in the slide afterwards, we do have a comprehensive list of just the HUD programs that are covered by VAWA. And I say HUD programs because there are also a number of other rental assistance programs that are administered by the U.S. Department of Agriculture through their Office of Rural Development, as well as Treasury Low-Income Housing Tax Credit Program. There are also a couple of programs under the VA, the Veterans Administration. They're also covered, as well as one transitional housing program through the Department of Justice. So many other federal housing programs are covered, but these are the ones that are under HUD. And so, you know, the sort of programs that you all sort of know about, chances are covered. So public housing, Section 8, you see here 22811. Next slide, please. There's also the multifamily rental assistance programs, the Section 8 programs. I think you also saw the McKinney-Vento program, so the ESG and COC programs. You know, any program or units that are receiving assistance under those programs are also covered by VAWA. Next slide, please. We also have the ability as an agency to identify additional programs that we want to cover under VAWA. And here we mentioned the right to report, which we've talked about a couple of times. Now, you might have noticed that VAWA does not cover your run-of-the-mill market rate unit. Right? We didn't talk about that. So VAWA only covers federal housing programs that provide rental assistance. So does that mean that housing providers can go ahead and discriminate survivors all they want in market units? No, absolutely not. There are other laws that apply that we're not going to touch on today, but just keep in mind that there are laws like the Federal Fair Housing Act. There are state and local laws that apply that provide critical housing protections for survivors, but we're not going to get into that today because of time constraints. Alrighty, so I'll go ahead and turn it to, I believe, Gordon.
All right, thank you very much, Carlo. I appreciate that. My name is Gordon Levine. My pronouns are he and him. I'm a technical assistance provider with YWCA. The majority of my time and my career has been spent in housing and homeless services, beginning at the community level and community action agency response, as well as leading local and state government homeless services response. Much of my time doing that work has overlapped with victim services providers and the role of VAWA in providing housing protections. And so I'm excited to join this webinar today and share with you a little bit about the roles of service providers and the actual housing provisions that VAWA offers to people who are living in subsidized housing. So the roles of service providers in implementing and applying VAWA housing protections, fundamentally, the first thing that service providers are required to do is understand their clients' goals, experiences, and preferences. And we do want to plug our previous webinar in this series, How to Identify People Impacted by Domestic Violence and Sexual Assault. It is available through that link, which can be accessed through these materials when they're posted. Fundamentally, everything else that we're saying here proceeds from that understanding that your role as a service provider is ultimately to understand where your participants are coming from and what they need to get the level of protection and services that they need. It also necessarily involves recognizing and identifying when VAWA housing protections might be available to participants. One of the things that we discussed in our previous webinar series is that VAWA housing protections are available to a wide range of people, and that the presentations of people who might qualify for housing protections vary widely. And so there is, I think, sometimes a preconceived notion of what a person looks like or presents as, or how they request services that indicates that they are subject to or could avail themselves of VAWA housing protections. The reality is that VAWA is available to everyone, and that people present and request services in all sorts of different ways that could trigger the recognition in a service provider that VAWA might be an appropriate route of services. Providing education for clients on housing, on VAWA housing protections. This applies to people that you think may, as well as participants who at this time might not be covered by or need VAWA housing protections, recognizing that people's life circumstances do change over time. It involves assisting survivors in making requests related to VAWA housing protections. And elements of that include helping survivors contact your local HUD office, as well as supporting survivors in filing fair housing complaints with the Fair Housing Equal Opportunity Office. As appropriate, there is a level of advocacy for survivors with housing providers, if that's something that a given service provider is able to do. If not, there is always the option to refer to service providers in your area who have a more active role in providing that protection and advocacy. And finally, as noted, identifying appropriate referrals for supportive or legal services. One of the most important tools in the service provider toolkit, regardless of where you are in the housing and housing counseling world, is knowing who in your community provides the services that you don't. So when you identify someone who needs VAWA housing protections, having a relationship with someone who can do that advocacy and that connection can really smooth the way to ensure people get the services that they need. Next slide, please. Additional housing protections, one of which is identifying adverse decisions regarding housing assistance as a result of VAWA covered violence and abuse committed against a survivor or related to VAWA violence and and abuse. We're talking about identifying an issue and advocating on behalf of it. And two of the sort of core problem areas around that are the denial of admission or assistance, which can happen at the housing service provider level or at the landlord or property owner level, and the eviction and termination of assistance, which again also can happen at either the housing provider or at the landlord or property owner levels. Certain other housing protections include emergency transfers, which we'll talk about more in depth later, but focus on ensuring participants who need a different unit get into one as quickly as possible. Lease bifurcation, which addresses what happens when a subsidized household needs to separate as the result of domestic violence, and how to provide housing in a way that is compliant and participant oriented in response to that situation, the right to report and who's covered by that right to report, and self-certification for VAWA protections. Next slide, please. So as far as assistance, denial, and termination of eviction goes, we talk about this as a lump protection, but really what we're talking about is when an applicant for assistance or housing is denied assistance or housing on the basis of domestic violence, that either they are on the receiving end with or associated with, or eviction. So after service has begun, the termination and eviction of assistance as a result of same. Housing providers can't deny admissions or assistance, and cannot evict, and cannot terminate a participant's assistance on the basis of the fact that they've been affected by VAWA violence or violence or abuse that is protected under the Violence Against Women Act because of VAWA violence or abuse committed against them, or for reasons related to VAWA covered violence or abuse, such as an eviction history, bad credit history, criminal history. Survivors have to have the option to stay in their current unit, even if there has been criminal activity directly related to the violence, the VAWA covered violence and abuse that we discussed. These VAWA protections that we're mentioning apply to residents, but also to tenants and to household members of those residents. So they apply to the family unit as a whole. And these protections, HUD refers to them as VAWA's core housing protections. The right to apply for assistance and not have that assistance limited on the basis of domestic violence or abuse, and the right to remain in housing, even if you are subject, unfortunately, to domestic violence or abuse. Next slide, please. So before discrimination happens, a potential action that a service provider might take is to educate clients about their rights, as we discussed, or ensure that that education occurs in partnership with a provider in your community that's prepared to make that education. After a potential incident of discrimination occurs, there are a variety of steps that service providers should take. Problem solving immediate housing solutions, which is really oriented around getting folks as quickly as possible into safe, stable housing. Assisting with fair housing complaint or advocacy around advocating for those rather with their housing provider. Referring them to legal services in the community, and connecting clients to other services. So we're going to go over the Mentimeter. We have a few scenarios that we'd like to go through with you. I can see that we've got a lot of interest in the Mentimeter. That's wonderful.
Okay, thank you, Tracy. That we just wanted to share a little bit about VAWA with you all, from a presentation that we all had to take. But there are a few takeaways that I wanted to point out in regards to the rest of that video. Want to make sure that everyone knows that the survivor always determines their safety. So it's up to them to let us know if they feel safe in that unit, if they need to relocate to another unit, another property, or even another city or state. All the information that's related to an emergency transfer plan must be kept very confidential. So this means that if a survivor does not sign a release of information that information cannot even be shared with other agencies. Only time we can do that is if there's a disclosure that is required by law that we disclose the information, or if there's a disclosure required by a court or a court official. A survivor cannot be denied or terminated from any housing assistance or evicted based on a survivor being domestic violence, having dating violence history, having a history of stalking situations, or sexual assault. So those are just some takeaways that we wanted to point out. And now we have Melissa.
Right. So like I said, my name is Melissa and I'm one of the other co-directors. I'm just going to briefly go over our Safe Center and our SANE nurses, just so that you have an idea of what they are. So we have a team of specially trained SANE nurses and advocates that when somebody is assaulted, either sexually or physically, they can go to a hospital, and both of our advocates and nurses will show up there to provide any support or resources that they might need. We also have our Safe Center, which is in our building. They can come here and get a rape kit done if necessary. They do, if they have medical issues, of course, they need to go to the hospital. But if they are coherent and medically cleared, they can come here and they don't have to wait in the emergency room for who knows how long. During that process, they will have the advocate come in here. If they want to call the police, we will sit with them for that. They're not required to call the police if they are assaulted. And then once our nurse does our rape kit, they of course can say no at any part of that and decide they don't want to do it, or they don't want to do this part of it. We will hold on to those for up to 18 months. So that way, if they don't want to respond or get the police involved at that moment, they have up to 18 months to do that. All they would need to do is call us, and then we would have them fill out another release of information so that we can call the police for them. And then of course, it goes back into that court support and all of that. So our advocates would definitely help them through the entire process. I know that was very brief, but does anybody have any questions about anything that was covered?
Okay, guys, the floor is open. It's your opportunity to ask questions, get clarification of the YWCA team.
So Tracy, we don't have any questions, but I had something additional I wanted to point out, that if you have any clients who need information around the VAWA Act or any support from our services, please reach out. The number is 810-238-SAFE. That is our crisis hotline number. And we're here to help and support anyone in our community who needs our services.
Thank you, Trina. Are there any questions from the community?
I do have a question.
Awesome, Heather.
I am an intake paralegal at Legal Services of Eastern Michigan. I recently had a client who called YWCA for services for domestic violence, and she swore that the Y advocate did not call her back, and I told her that was very unusual. I'd never heard of such a thing, and we finally figured out that it seems that the advocate called back, but did not leave a message, which is understandable. We have similar protocols depending on the situation. Is if you return a call for a survivor and you get their voicemail, is it true that you wouldn't leave a message? And do you tell them that at the time of their initial call, the intake call?
I can go ahead, Melissa.
So that kind of varies per different client, of course. So when they call the crisis line and say speak to Tamika, if they tell us that it's not safe, or if they're kind of hesitant about it, we won't leave a message and we'll just try to call back. And of course that gets kind of confusing, and sometimes they do feel like that we're not reaching back out. But it's all comes back to their safety, of course.
No, okay, thank you.
And I would also like to add, we didn't have a lot of slides for this presentation, but we're gonna send the slides out. And attached with that will also be our assessment form where you can see the questions that we do ask survivors. But that's one of the things that I know Tamika, I've witnessed her cause. If she asks, is it, we always ask if it's safe to call. So usually we call back, but we do not leave a message because we don't know if that assailant may have the phone or may have access to the voicemail. So 9 times out of 10, we will not leave a message. And I will make sure that that's added to our assessment so that survivors are aware of that piece. Thank you for that.
Can I add something? Also, a lot of the times when the advocates do call back, depending on if they're calling back from their office number, it does show up private. So a lot of our survivors don't answer private calls. And then also, you know, if we don't leave a voicemail, then they will never know we called. Yep, so I just wanted to add that.
So I guess I probably have a couple of questions. Another question I had is when I'm talking to a survivor and I suggest that they call the Y and they say, well, okay, but what can they do for me? Basically in elevator speech form, what is it that you prefer that we summarize? You know, if you call them, this is what you can expect, or this is what they might be able to do for you. What is a summary and easy and accurate way to tell them what to expect when they call?
So what I would say is when they call our crisis helpline, that they're gonna get some form of help. So if our shelter is full, they will be transferred to an advocate. That advocate will then assist them with finding a safe option to stay, whether we have to put them in a hotel for a couple of days, whether we reach out to other domestic violence shelters outside of the county, and then bring them back when we do have room here at our shelter. Whether it's to do safety planning to help them figure out a safe option until we can get them into, you know, our program. It could be filing that personal protection order. But we try to get everyone to come in and figure out what that person needs, because it's going to be case by case. But our goal is to, when we get off the phone with survivors or survivors leave our office, is for them to feel safe, whatever that may look like for them.
Okay, and we sometimes get calls from people who would like help getting a PPO, but it's not necessarily intimate partner violence. Sometimes it might be a senior with an adult child who is putting them in danger. It might be a neighbor and a neighbor. Do you help anyone who needs help with a PPO? If you only help in certain circumstances, do you know other resources that help people in the Genesee County area with PPOs?
So we only assist with intimate partner PPOs, and unfortunately, the only other resource that I know is going straight to the PPO office. I know that can be a little scary and kind of intimidating for some people, but from what I am aware, in Genesee County, that's the only resources for anybody besides intimate partner.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, I know that when they go to the office, the courthouse is very limited in what they can, you know, what they can tell them about the form. Of course, they can't give them legal advice. So that's good to know that that's a need that's not being filled in our community at this point. So I appreciate that. And I think that's all the questions I had.
Thank you, Heather. Those were great questions. Is there anyone else that would have a question or need clarification? I have a quick question. It just came up as you guys were explaining. If a client calls in that assessment process, do we let them know, to your point, they won't answer private calls. Do we let them know And I think you do, but do you communicate to them that the number is going to be is going to come across as private so that they would answer the phones?
So, to speak to that, it's not on our form, Tracy, but our advocates do try to do that. I'm learning too, on this training, so that's something that we will add to make sure that survivors do know. I know, some of us say it, but I can't say it's across the board at this time, but it will be added to our form to make sure that every advocate is explaining that to our survivors.
Thank you, Trina. Emily Weed has her hand up.
Hello, I had two questions, please. If you could give me a suggestion for folks that I might come in contact with that do not have a phone, and our team might not be with them for, that long period of time or that period of time for getting a call back. Do you have any suggestions as what they could do?
So, our building is open Monday through Thursday. And we have an advocate here from 8 a.m. to midnight on those during that time. But even if someone was to come and ring our doorbell, our advocates will have someone reach out to them and talk with them, one of our on-call staff. But if you can get them down here during the times that we are open, we can assess their situation, and we will also help them get a phone. If that's a need that we assess during their assessment, we will help with that.
That's wonderful. Okay, thank you. And then I also was curious, I run into a lot of clients that say, I've been to the Y and I can't go back there. Could you maybe explain, is there a certain amount of time someone is allowed to access services, or what are your rules about that?
So our door never closes to any survivor. Even if for reasons the survivor had to transition for safety reasons, that survivor is still welcome back. We never say a survivor cannot come back. The only way we would not house someone is if they no longer fit our criteria.
Great. Thank you, Trina.
You're welcome.
Can I say something too about being able to contact us? If the client doesn't have a phone, they can also, if they have access to a computer, they can also email. They can go to the YWCA website and send an email, then that gets sent out to the advocates also, if they have access, if that helps.
In addition, I want to talk about a safety plan that we do here is if those old cell phones. So if anyone that has old cell phones, please donate them to us, because what we do is some of our families who have children, we charge those old cell phones up, and those children can have those phones, and those phones will always call 911. And that's an additional safety plan. So if the client doesn't have a phone, but if the client has an old phone that maybe is not on anymore, let that client know that they charge that phone, they're able to call 911. And I don't know any police department in our community that will not bring a client to the YWCA if that person is feeling unsafe. So utilize the 911, those old phones, and our local police departments are great.
Thank you, Trina. Are there any other questions?
I actually had one more. I almost forgot. This is Heather again at Legal Services. I sometimes talk to survivors who say they have a PPO, but the police won't enforce it. So they maybe the partner shows up at their house, they call the police, the partner takes off, the police show up and say, well, it's your word against the partner, or whatever it is. There's a lot of different situations. Is that something that that the Y assists with as and maybe it's miscommunication with the police? Of course, people in trauma have aren't always, well, it may have trouble communicating what they actually mean, of course, or remembering, but does the Y help with situations where the survivor feels like the police is not enforcing the PPO?
Um,
I'm sorry, Melissa, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
The clients can also come in, they could come in or contact us and we can help them file a violation through the court system against the PPO, they get a court date and they have to go in and they can violate the respondent, the person that they're the abuser, in the court system. That's one way that we can help them.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, the client I mentioned earlier, that was one of her issues, and I thought that was something you could at least advise on. So it's good to know. Thank you.
Trina and Melissa, you're off mute. Was there something you were going to say?
Nope.
Okay, are there any other questions? This is the time. Thank you, Heather. Thank you, Emily, for asking the questions. All right, well, we would like to thank the YWCA, the staff for providing our annual VAWA training and how to engage our clients that are experiencing domestic violence. We thank you for your time. I learned a lot today. We thank you, and for everyone, have a great weekend, and we will see you later. Thank you, YWCA. Great job.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good day.
All right,
Have a good day.
thank you. Aaron, you can stop the recording.